The farm had been in their family for generations. It was more than just a piece of land, it was a symbol of everything they had worked for, a reminder of the sweat and tears that had been poured into the soil for years. But one fateful day, that symbol was ripped away. The bank's decision was final. The letters, cold and sterile, had been delivered, no room for negotiation. The family was losing everything. The fields that once fed their children, the barn that had sheltered their livestock, and the home where they had created memories would soon be gone. It was a devastating blow, one that seemed impossible to recover from. No amount of hard work or determination could undo the chain of events that led to this moment. And yet, in the face of such overwhelming loss, something unexpected happened. The horse, always a quiet presence, never asking for attention, stepped in. It wasn't just any horse. This was a creature who had shared in the family's hardships, a companion through every trial. But what unfolded in the days following the loss of the farm would leave even the hardest of hearts shaken. For weeks, the family had tried to figure out how to cope with the immense weight of their loss. There was little time for anything but the practicalities, packing up their belongings, trying to find a new place to live, and figuring out how to make ends meet. But through it all, one member of the family stood out, unspoken yet unshakable. The horse had been through it all, weathering every storm alongside them. And now, as the family struggled to find their footing, the horse would do something that would leave them speechless, frozen in a moment of disbelief. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew still, the horse did something that no one could have predicted. It wasn't a grand gesture or an act of defiance, it was something quieter, something more profound. It was a message, clear and unspoken, of resilience, loyalty, and love. What this horse did next would change everything, shifting the very foundation of what the family believed they had lost. But what happened next? What caused this animal to act in such a remarkable way, and how would the family respond? Could it be possible that, in their darkest hour, this horse would show them something they had long forgotten, that hope is sometimes found in the most unexpected places? The answer was just around the corner, but to find out, the family would first have to face something much larger than their own grief. The days following the loss of the farm felt like a blur, a steady wave of monotony that kept pushing forward, relentless and unforgiving. The family tried to hold on to what little they had left, but the reality of their situation sank in deeper with every passing moment. Their lives, once rooted in the soil they had worked for decades, were now uncertain. The barn had emptied out, the animals sold off, and the house, which had once been full of laughter and warmth, now sat eerily quiet, almost as if it were mourning the life it had once supported. They had known the farm would be at risk for some time, but nothing prepares you for that final blow, the moment when your world unravels in front of your eyes, leaving you with nothing but the pieces to pick up. They'd done everything they could, applied for loans, worked extra hours, cut back on everything. But the bank had been clear. The debts were too much, the loans overdue, and the decision final. It was out of their hands. As the weight of their loss pressed down on them, it was clear the family was struggling to keep up appearances. Every day seemed to drain more and more energy. The father, once the pillar of strength for everyone around him, had grown quieter, withdrawn. He had always been the one to come up with a plan, to offer solutions when things seemed impossible. But now, nothing he did seemed to change the fact that the land was slipping away from them, just like everything else. His shoulders slumped a little more each day, and though he still tried to keep up the routine of work, there was an emptiness in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. The mother, always a source of warmth and comfort, had become more distant as well. The smile that had once come so easily now seemed forced. She spent long hours staring out the kitchen window, watching the sunset over fields that would no longer be hers. There were moments when her gaze lingered on the empty barn, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. But no one came, and the silence was deafening. The children, too young to understand all of the adult complexities, had retreated into themselves, finding solace in their own ways. The youngest spent hours in the garden, as if trying to hold on to the last remnants of a place that once felt like home. The older ones had found distractions in their own quiet ways, one burying themselves in books, the other lost in daydreams. Yet despite their best efforts, the quiet sadness hung over the family like a cloud. Through all of this, there was one constant. The horse. The same horse that had been there when the children were small, watching over them as they played in the fields. The same horse that had stood by the father during long nights of work, never once questioning his loyalty or devotion. The horse had always been a part of the family, but now it seemed to carry an even deeper weight. It wandered through the yard, often standing still and looking toward the fields, as if it could sense the loss in a way that no one else could. Its gaze was steady, almost as though it were waiting for something or someone. The family didn't know what to make of it. At first, it seemed like any other animal behavior, an odd quirk, perhaps, brought on by the changes happening around them. But as days passed and the silence deepened, the horse's actions began to take on a strange significance. It would follow the children when they wandered out to the pasture, watching them from the edge of the fields, never straying too far. And when the father went out to check on the fence lines, the horse would always be there, standing a little further away than usual, but never out of sight. There were moments when the horse seemed to sense the family's mood, moving closer when it felt the weight of their grief, retreating when the distance was needed. It was as though the horse understood more than any of them could put into words. And yet, no one could explain why, despite the family's sense of hopelessness, the horse remained. Why, when all seemed lost, did it stay? Was it a mere animal instinct, or was there something deeper at play? The first sign that something was amiss came one cold evening, when the father went to check on the horse as he always did, before heading back inside for the night. The barn was empty, but the horse was nowhere to be found. At first, he thought it had simply wandered off, but something felt off. He knew that the horse wasn't the type to stray too far, especially not when it could sense the family's turmoil. He called out for it, his voice echoing in the stillness of the night. Nothing. The only sound that reached his ears was the distant wind, whispering through the trees. Panic set in, and for a moment, he felt that familiar, unsettling tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had gotten when he had first realized the farm was slipping through his fingers. The barn was silent. He took a few steps back, then stopped. That's when he saw a small trail leading toward the edge of the property, toward the woods. The horse was somewhere out there, and the father could feel the inexplicable pull to follow. It didn't make sense. Why would the horse be in the woods at this hour, especially when it had always stayed close to the farm? Without thinking, he grabbed his coat and hurried out the door. The ground was cold, the earth hard beneath his boots as he followed the trail, every step heavy with the weight of worry. He knew the woods were dense, and it wasn't a place to wander after dark. But the horse was out there, and something told him that he couldn't afford to ignore it. The deeper he went, the more the air seemed to change. It was as if the trees themselves had grown still, holding their breath, waiting. The only sound that broke the silence was the faint rustle of leaves beneath his feet. The trail seemed to grow more defined as he pushed forward, leading him deeper into the woods. His heart pounded louder now, his every instinct urging him to turn back. But he couldn't. Not now. The path led him to a clearing, the last place he would have expected to find the horse. But there it was, standing still in the middle of the clearing, its head held high. The horse was staring at something, its gaze locked on a point just beyond the father's reach. He couldn't see what it was, not at first, but something in the air felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The father took another step forward, his breath coming faster now. The horse didn't move. Its attention was fixed on something in the distance. Something or someone that he couldn't see. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. There was no one else in the clearing, nothing else that could explain the horse's intense focus. And yet, as he stood there in the growing silence, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Something big. But what? And why did the horse seem to know it before anyone else? As the minutes ticked by, the air grew colder, the tension rising. What was the horse waiting for? Why had it led him out here? What was the secret that lay hidden in the woods, just beyond his reach? The father stood frozen, unable to take another step, his mind racing with unanswered questions. The mystery of the horse's behavior hung heavy in the air, an unspoken promise that the story was far from over. And as he watched the horse in that eerie silence, he couldn't help but wonder if the answer was closer than he thought, or if the mystery would lead them all into something they weren't ready to face. The father stood there, the chill of the woods creeping into his bones as he watched the horse in the clearing. There was something deeply unsettling about the way it stood motionless, almost as though it were waiting for something. His eyes flicked from the horse to the shadows of the trees beyond, but no matter how hard he strained his gaze, there was nothing to be seen. The air hung heavy, thick with tension. He took a cautious step forward, his boots crunching on the frozen leaves beneath him. The horse didn't flinch. It remained fixated on whatever lay just out of view. The father's breath quickened as he wondered if he had imagined something, if the weight of everything that had happened recently was beginning to take its toll on his mind. But the feeling in the pit of his stomach told him otherwise. There was something important here, something he couldn't yet understand. His mind wandered back to the day they received the news about the farm. How the shock of it had taken over every conversation, every thought. The letters from the bank, the pleading phone calls, the desperate attempts to find any way to stop the inevitable. But it had been useless. And now, as he stood in the forest, feeling like a small piece of something much larger, he couldn't help but think that maybe there was more to the loss than just bad luck or poor decisions. Maybe this was a test. A challenge that the family hadn't yet faced. Could the horse somehow be a part of it? Was it leading him here for a reason? He glanced again at the horse. Its head was now slightly lowered, but its eyes remained locked on the same spot. Something was happening here, something that could change everything. But what? His thoughts raced as he tried to put it all together. And then, as though the horse sensed his anxiety, it shifted, its body suddenly tense. The father froze, a shiver running up his spine. The air seemed to vibrate, as though something was stirring in the space between them. The sound of footsteps broke through the silence. Faint at first, but growing louder by the second. The father whipped his head around, heart pounding. But there was no one in sight. Yet, he could hear them footsteps, unmistakable. It was as if the world around him had taken on a life of its own, moving in ways he couldn't control or predict. And then, in the distance, he saw it. A figure, barely visible, moving through the trees. At first, he thought it was just his eyes playing tricks on him. After all, he had been out here alone for a while now. But the figure grew clearer with each passing second, and what he saw left him speechless. It wasn't a person, but something far more unsettling. The figure was tall, dark, and seemed to shimmer slightly in the moonlight. The edges of it weren't defined, like it was shifting between forms. A sense of dread washed over him. The horse had moved now, standing tall and alert, its body coiled like a spring. It was watching the figure too, its gaze unwavering. But instead of retreating, the father took a step forward, compelled by something he couldn't explain. He had to know what this was, even if it terrified him. The figure didn't approach. It stayed at the edge of the trees, as though waiting for the father to make the next move. He could feel its presence, a strange pull in the air, as if it were beckoning him, daring him to come closer. "Who's there?" The father called out, his voice shaking despite his best efforts to sound confident. The figure didn't answer. There was no sound, no movement except for the eerie shimmer that surrounded it. The horse snorted, taking a step forward as if ready to defend the father from whatever this thing was. But the figure remained still, its presence too overwhelming to ignore. The father hesitated, uncertain if he should continue forward or retreat back to the farm. But something deep within him urged him to move closer. He took another step, then another, until he was standing just at the edge of the clearing, staring into the darkness where the figure had stood. And just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure vanished, dissolving into the night like mist. The father stood frozen, his breath coming in short bursts. He had seen it, hadn't he? It wasn't a trick of the light. There had been something there. But now, there was nothing. The clearing was empty once more, and the only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves. "Dad?" a voice called from behind him. It was the voice of one of the children, a worried tone creeping into their words. He turned quickly, heart pounding, and saw them standing just at the edge of the woods. The younger one, clutching a blanket and looking confused, the older one standing a few steps behind. "What are you doing out here?" the father asked, trying to hide the panic that had settled in his chest. "We heard you yelling," the older child said, eyes wide with concern. "What's going on?" I thought I saw something," the father said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But it's gone now." The children exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the unease in their father's voice. "What kind of something?" the younger one asked, fear creeping into their words. "I don't know," the father admitted. "But I think we should head back to the house. It's getting late." The family made their way back to the farm, the father's mind still racing with what he had just experienced. What had that figure been? And why had it appeared just when he needed answers the most? The horse had seemed to recognize it, but it hadn't reacted like it would to any other person or animal. There was something different about this presence, something that couldn't be explained by logic or reason. As they walked back, the family tried to shake off the strange events of the night, but the air felt thicker now, heavier. The father couldn't let go of the feeling that something was about to happen, something big. He had no proof, no clear answers, but the unease wouldn't leave him. His eyes kept drifting to the spot where the figure had been, even though he knew there was nothing there now. The trees stood tall and silent, as if nothing out of the ordinary had occurred. Back at the house, the family tried to go about their usual routines, but the sense of mystery lingered. The mother sat at the kitchen table, absently stirring a cup of tea, while the children played quietly in the corner. The father stood by the window, looking out at the darkened fields, lost in thought. The farm felt different now, heavier, somehow as though the land itself was aware of the change that had come. Outside, the wind howled, as though echoing the unease that had settled within the family. The horse stood in the barn, still and quiet, its eyes turned toward the distant woods. Something had changed for it too. But what was it? And why had it seemed so intent on guiding the father into the woods that night? With each passing hour, the mystery grew deeper. The horse's behavior, the strange figure in the woods, it was all too much to ignore. The family's lives had been upended by the loss of their farm, but now there was something else in the air, something darker, something they couldn't yet understand. And as the night stretched on, they couldn't shake the feeling that their lives were about to be changed in ways they couldn't predict. Would they ever truly understand what had happened that night? Or was it just the beginning of something far more complicated and unsettling? The days that followed felt like a slow spiral, each moment hanging heavily in the air, charged with an unseen force. The father's mind remained consumed by the eerie figure in the woods, unable to shake the image of it disappearing into the shadows. The strange presence had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He kept trying to rationalize it, telling himself it was just his imagination running wild under the strain of everything that had happened. But deep down, he knew better. There was something more going on, something he wasn't ready to confront. The family had tried to return to their routine, but the tension in the house was palpable. The silence was thicker now, more suffocating, as if the walls themselves had become witnesses to a story unfolding just beneath the surface. The horse remained a constant presence, its eyes always watching, always waiting. But even its watchful gaze couldn't offer the comfort it once had. It was as if it too had become a part of the strange energy that had settled over the farm. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, the father ventured outside again, feeling the pull of something unspoken. The air was unusually still, the evening calm, too quiet, almost unnatural. The wind had stopped, the leaves no longer rustling in the trees. It was as if the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He stepped onto the porch, eyes scanning the land around him. The horse was nowhere to be seen. He hadn't noticed its absence until now, and the realization made his stomach drop. The barn door was ajar, and the usual sound of hooves on the ground was missing. He hesitated for a moment, unease building in his chest, before he took a deep breath and walked toward the barn. With each step, the tension tightened in his chest. He was about to open the barn door when a sudden movement caught his eye. There, in the distance, he saw it again, the figure. This time, it was standing in the field, no longer hidden in the trees. The same dark, shifting form. The same feeling of wrongness in the air. The father's heart raced as he froze, caught between fear and an overwhelming sense of needing to understand what this all meant. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. It was as though the very space between them had become charged with something ancient, something that had been waiting to awaken. The father's breath was shallow, his legs unwilling to move forward. His mind screamed at him to turn around, to go back inside, to pretend none of this was real. But another part of him, the part that had always been able to face challenges head-on, told him that he couldn't run away from this. Whatever was happening, he needed to face it. As if on cue, the horse appeared from the shadows of the barn, its large, dark eyes locked on the figure in the field. It stood still for a moment, its tail flicking, its breath steady. Then, slowly, almost deliberately, it began to move toward the figure, its hooves making no sound on the grass. The father watched in disbelief as the horse moved closer, drawn to the figure as if it knew something he didn't. A chill ran through him. What was happening? Why was the horse so intent on getting closer to the figure, even when the air around them felt so charged with danger? He took a step forward, unable to stay still any longer. His heart hammered in his chest, but he couldn't let this go unanswered. What was this thing? What was it doing to his family? The father's hand gripped the edge of the barn door, knuckles white, as he watched the horse approach the figure. The world around him seemed to grow dimmer, quieter, as if every sound had been sucked out of the air. Then, just as he thought the horse would get too close, something shifted. The figure started to move, slowly at first, but with an unmistakable purpose. It was coming toward him. Toward the farm. Toward them. The father's breath caught in his throat. "Get back!" he shouted to the horse, but the animal didn't respond. It was as if it had become part of the very atmosphere of the moment, locked into this strange dance between worlds. The figure stopped just at the edge of the field, its dark, shapeless form looming over the land. It didn't speak, but the air seemed to grow colder, the ground beneath his feet beginning to feel less solid. The father's eyes darted around, looking for any sign of something, anything that could help him make sense of this. The family had faced so much already: the loss of the farm, the mounting debt, the feeling of their lives being torn apart. But this? This was something entirely different. It wasn't just the end of their farm. It felt like the end of everything they knew. And yet, in the face of it all, the horse remained unwavering, its gaze fixed on the figure, as if it were waiting for the right moment to act. The father took another step forward, drawn by an invisible force. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but the figure was already in his mind. It was as though the very presence of it was pulling him closer. The closer he got, the more disoriented he became. The world felt like it was bending, the edges of reality blurring. He could hear a faint whisper, a soft voice on the wind, though he couldn't make out the words. "Dad?" The voice came from behind him, sharp and cutting through the fog in his mind. He turned quickly, only to see the children standing at the edge of the porch, their faces pale with fear. The younger one had a hand on their sibling's shoulder, their eyes wide with confusion. "Dad, what's going on?" the older one asked, their voice trembling. The father opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He had no answer for them. How could he explain the unexplainable? The terror he felt wasn't just for himself, it was for them, too. He could feel it now, the weight of everything that had been building, the pressure of this strange force bearing down on them all. The figure in the field remained still, but its presence was unmistakable. The father's mind raced, unable to find any solution, any escape. He glanced at the horse, standing motionless as ever. Whatever was happening, it was clear that the horse knew something he didn't. The father opened his mouth to shout, to tell his family to run, to leave the farm behind and never look back. But before he could speak, the ground beneath his feet shifted. It was subtle at first, a small tremor, but it was enough to unnerve him. He stumbled, caught off guard. The air grew thick with something that felt like an impending storm. The figure's presence loomed even larger now, as if it had been waiting for the right moment to reveal itself completely. The father's heart raced, every instinct telling him they were standing on the edge of something monumental. Something that was about to change everything. The question was, could they survive whatever was coming next? Could they face it together, or would the weight of this mystery tear them apart? The tension was unbearable. The figure remained, the air heavy with something just out of reach. And as the father stood there, heart pounding, he couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was about to unfold, it would be a test. A test of everything they had left. As the father stood frozen, the air around him thick with uncertainty, something unexpected happened. The ground beneath his feet, still trembling ever so slightly, began to shift more violently. The low rumble grew louder, as if the earth itself were beginning to awaken. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest, his body screaming at him to move. But before he could react, a blinding light erupted from the figure in the field. It wasn't the soft glow of moonlight or the natural brightness of the night, it was an unnatural, searing light that pierced through the air with a deafening hum. For a moment, everything went still. The light enveloped the figure, and the father felt the pressure in the air intensify, almost suffocating him. The figure's form began to shift, distort, and grow, as though the very fabric of reality were bending around it. His mind screamed for him to look away, but he couldn't. He was entranced, unable to move as the figure expanded, towering over the field, its edges crackling with energy. "Dad! What is that?" The voice of his child broke through the chaos, and the father snapped his head back to see them standing at the edge of the porch, their eyes wide with fear. The younger child clung to the older one, both of them visibly shaking, but there was nothing he could say to reassure them. Not now. The horse, too, was moving, its body trembling with an energy the father couldn't quite understand. It snorted and stamped its hooves, eyes wide and alert. The father watched as the horse took one slow step forward, its gaze never leaving the figure. It was as if the animal knew something he couldn't comprehend, something dangerous was about to unfold. Then, the impossible happened. The ground cracked open. The sharp, jagged sound of splitting earth sent a shockwave through the air, and the father instinctively took a step back, grabbing for the children who were still standing too close to the edge of the porch. A massive crack appeared in the earth between them and the figure, splitting the land as if it were paper. The light from the figure flickered like a dying star, casting long, eerie shadows across the field. And in the very center of that crack, something began to rise. It was a massive shape, dark and formless, rising from the earth itself. It had no discernible shape, no clear outline. It was like a shadow made real, stretching up to meet the sky. The father's heart skipped a beat as the sense of dread washed over him again. It was as if the land itself had given birth to this thing, a darkness that defied every law of nature. The air grew heavier, suffocating. It was like a physical weight pressing down on them, and the father could feel his lungs straining for breath. But the figure in the field, still shifting and changing, didn't seem to notice. It stood tall, a beacon of unnatural power, and for the first time, the father realized that it wasn't just a figure, it was a force. A force that was inextricably linked to everything that had happened, to the loss of the farm, to the family's desperate struggle to hold on to what they had. This wasn't just a random encounter. This was something personal. A sudden, sharp sound cut through the tension, a sound like the tearing of fabric, but far more unsettling. The dark figure that had risen from the earth began to take shape, its presence pushing back against the light. And then it spoke. It wasn't a voice. It was a vibration in the air, something that could be felt rather than heard. It reverberated through the father's bones, making his teeth rattle and his skin crawl. The words, if they could even be called words, were incomprehensible, a language that didn't belong in the world of the living. "Get back!" The father's voice was hoarse as he screamed at the children to run. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew it was too late. The ground beneath them shifted again, and this time, it wasn't just the land that was moving. The entire farm seemed to tremble, as if the very foundation of everything they knew was being torn apart. The horse was the first to react. It bolted forward, a sudden burst of motion that startled the father into action. He reached for the children, pulling them back from the edge of the porch as the earth continued to quake. The figure in the field, now fully formed, seemed to be pulling something from the land itself. The air crackled with energy, and the father felt the hairs on his neck stand on end. Something was wrong. This wasn't just an otherworldly presence. This was a reckoning. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, the figure stopped. The earth stilled, and the air went eerily quiet. The dark form that had risen from the ground was gone, leaving only the gaping crack in the earth as evidence that something impossible had just occurred. The father's heart was still racing. His mind was reeling, unable to process the events that had just unfolded. What had just happened? What had that thing been? And why did it feel like their lives had been irrevocably changed? He turned to the children, their faces pale and filled with fear. They were still clinging to each other, eyes wide with confusion. The younger one whispered, "Dad, what's happening? What was that thing?" The father opened his mouth, but no words came. He wanted to tell them that everything would be okay, that it was all just some horrible nightmare they would wake up from. But he knew that wasn't the truth. Something was out there, something far beyond their understanding, and it was only just beginning. The horse, still in the field, turned its head toward them. Its eyes met the father's, and for a moment, there was a strange understanding between them. The father couldn't explain it, but he knew the horse understood what was happening more than he ever could. The animal's stance was steady, its body poised like a sentinel waiting for the next command. And then, as if acknowledging the tension in the air, the figure in the field flickered, shifting once more. It was moving again, but this time, it wasn't just an empty shape. It was something more, something that felt alive. The father's blood ran cold. The stakes were higher now. Everything had changed. What was happening on their farm? What had they unwittingly become part of? The story they had been living was no longer just about losing their home. It was about survival, surviving something far more terrifying than they had ever imagined. And as the tension mounted, the father felt the weight of the unknown press down on him harder than ever. What would happen next? Would they survive this? Or was there something even darker waiting to claim them all? The uncertainty gnawed at him, and all he could do was watch as the figure shifted in the distance, growing ever closer. The family had no choice but to face what was coming. The father's pulse thudded in his ears as the figure began to move again, its dark, formless shape creeping closer to the farm. The atmosphere had grown suffocating, the air thick with tension. The horse, still standing firm in the field, began to trot forward, its hooves silent on the earth. It moved with purpose, its eyes locked on the dark presence ahead. The father instinctively reached for his children, pulling them toward the porch, desperate to protect them, to shield them from whatever was coming. But there was no escaping this. The world felt like it was folding in on itself. The once peaceful land was now a battleground between forces beyond their comprehension. The father watched, helpless, as the horse walked straight toward the shadow. It seemed as though the animal knew its place in this strange drama unfolding before him. Its movements were deliberate, its body poised like a warrior preparing for something monumental. The father stepped forward, unsure of what to do next. His mind was racing, trying to piece together everything that had happened: the loss of the farm, the inexplicable figure in the woods, the strange disturbances that had gripped their lives. He had spent every waking moment trying to protect his family from the weight of their misfortune, but now, faced with something far more terrifying than he could have ever imagined, he realized the fight wasn't just about keeping the farm. It was about protecting their very souls. As the horse neared the figure, the father's heart nearly stopped. He had never seen the animal so calm, so certain. It stopped just short of the shadow, standing still in the moonlight. The figure loomed over them both, its presence overwhelming, as if it was more than just a shape. It was a force that reached deep into the earth itself, feeding off of something primal. The father moved to step closer, but before he could reach them, the air around him began to shimmer, a faint ripple spreading through the night. He blinked, disoriented, and then it happened. The ground beneath the horse cracked wide open, splitting like a fissure in the earth. A deep, guttural sound came from the very depths of the land, and the father staggered back, trying to shield his children from the raw power that had unleashed itself. But the horse didn't flinch. It stood steady, unfazed by the chaos erupting around it. And then, with a movement so quick it was almost imperceptible, the animal reared back on its hind legs and let out a loud, commanding whinny sound that seemed to resonate deep within the earth, vibrating the air with raw energy. The shadow figure halted. The air went still once more, the oppressive feeling lifting, replaced by a strange silence. The father couldn't breathe. The land was no longer shaking. The crack in the earth that had seemed so alive with darkness now lay still, like the aftermath of a storm. He dared to move forward, his eyes locked on the horse. He could feel the change, something fundamental shifting in the very fabric of the world around him. Then, as if in answer to the horse's call, the figure began to dissolve. It melted into the night, fading like smoke on the wind. The dark presence, which had been a constant threat to their survival, was now slipping away, retreating into the shadows from which it had come. The father's breath caught in his chest. Was it over? Had the horse somehow banished it? But as the figure faded, the ground beneath them began to rumble again, more violently this time. The father turned, heart racing, unsure of what to expect. He grabbed the children's hands, pulling them back toward the house. But then, just as suddenly as the tremors had started, everything went quiet. The world stilled, and the oppressive weight that had held them all in place was lifted. The father, his body trembling with exhaustion, looked back at the field. The horse stood still, its gaze unwavering. The land around them was silent once more. The eerie light from the figure had disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the moon. The farm was no longer under siege. And yet, something wasn't right. As the father stepped forward, he realized the truth. The farm, the land they had fought so hard to save, was now irrevocably changed. It was as if a piece of it had been torn away, leaving an emptiness that would never be filled. The soil beneath his feet felt different, colder somehow, as though it no longer belonged to the world he had known. As he turned back to look at his family, he saw that the children were staring not at him, but at the horse. Their eyes were wide, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The younger ones spoke first, their voice barely a whisper. "Dead, the horse. It's..." The father turned to follow their gaze, and his blood ran cold. The horse wasn't the same anymore. Its eyes, once kind and familiar, were now dark, almost otherworldly. They gleamed with a strange, unsettling intensity. The animal stood taller now, its body more imposing, as though it had been transformed by whatever had just occurred. It wasn't just a horse anymore, it was something more. Something ancient. The father's mind raced. Had the horse been the key all along? Had it been guiding them, protecting them from something far darker than they could have ever imagined? The feeling of unease washed over him again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't fear, it was a recognition of something he hadn't wanted to face. The horse had always known. It had always been more than just a farm animal. It had been waiting for this moment, for the right time to reveal its true nature. The transformation wasn't just physical, it was something deeper. And now, as the figure vanished into the night, the father understood. The family had been caught in the middle of something ancient and powerful, something that couldn't be stopped or erased. The land, the horse, the shadow, it was all part of a cycle that had always existed, one that would never truly end. As the horse turned and walked back into the shadows of the field, the father felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. There was no going back. The farm had been lost, but more than that, their lives, their very existence, had been changed forever. The horse wasn't just an animal anymore. It was a keeper of secrets, a link to something beyond their comprehension. The father stood there, staring into the darkness, knowing that the real story wasn't over. It was just beginning. The final twist hadn't been the figure in the field. No, it had been the horse, and the realization that everything they thought they knew had been a lie. They had been pawns in a much larger game, one that would shape their futures in ways they couldn't yet understand. And as the last traces of light faded from the field, the father knew that their journey had only just begun. What would they do now? What more would they learn about the world they had thought was so simple, so safe? The answers were out there, hidden in the shadows. The only question left was whether they were brave enough to face them. As the days passed, the farm seemed to settle into a strange calm. The violent tremors that had shaken the earth, the eerie light, and the dark figure, everything had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The land was still, quiet once again, but the father couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. He stood at the edge of the field, looking out across the acres that had once felt like home, but now seemed foreign, alien even. It was as if a shadow had been cast over everything. The horse, though, had not changed. It remained steadfast, its presence somehow more powerful than before. Every time the father looked at it, he felt a quiet sense of awe, as if the animal were still a keeper of some deep, ancient secret. But that secret, whatever it was beyond his understanding. The horse had stood between them and something far darker, and yet it had not revealed its true nature fully. The father wasn't sure if he was grateful for that or afraid of it. Over the following weeks, life on the farm settled into a new routine. The children, still shaken by the events of that night, tried to go about their days as normally as possible. They helped with the chores, fed the animals, and did what they could to restore a sense of normalcy. But there was an unspoken tension that hung over them all, a feeling that the farm was no longer just a place to live. It was something more, something that carried the weight of the supernatural events they had witnessed. The father had tried to reach out to others, friends, neighbors, anyone who might have experienced something similar. But there were no answers. People were either too scared to talk about what they had seen or simply dismissed it as a trick of the mind. It was as if the whole world was determined to forget what had happened, to pretend that the farm had not been touched by something far beyond the ordinary. One afternoon, as the father was walking through the fields, he saw the horse again. It stood in the same spot it had before, its head turned slightly toward him, watching him with an intensity that made him pause. The horse's gaze seemed to pierce through him, as if it were trying to communicate something important. Without thinking, the father walked toward it. His heart beat faster as he approached, unsure of what to expect. When he reached the animal, he stopped just a few feet away, feeling the weight of its gaze on him. The horse didn't move, didn't flinch. It simply stood there, its body still and calm. Why? The father whispered, more to himself than to the horse. Why did this happen? The horse blinked slowly, its eyes filled with an unreadable depth. The father didn't know if it was the animal or something else, something much older, that was looking back at him, but he couldn't help the sense that he was in the presence of something ancient, something that had existed long before the farm, before the family had arrived. Something that had witnessed the rise and fall of generations, the cycles of life and death, and had borne witness to the mysteries of the earth itself. Suddenly, the air around him shifted. It was subtle, like a soft breeze stirring the leaves, but it felt different this time. The air was charged with energy, the same energy that had crackled through the field on that night when the earth had split open. He didn't know why, but the father felt at the moment of connection, the realization that this was all part of something much bigger. He understood, in that moment, that the horse wasn't just a protector. It was a part of the land, a force of nature, a guardian of a balance that he could not fully comprehend. The father reached out a hand, hesitantly at first, unsure of how the horse might react. But the animal didn't pull away. Instead, it lowered its head slightly, as if acknowledging his presence, as if giving him permission to approach further. Slowly, the father placed his hand on the horse's neck, feeling the warmth of its coat beneath his fingers. The contact was brief, but in that instant, everything he had been struggling with, the loss, the fear, the confusion, began to fade. For the first time since the night everything changed, he felt a sense of peace. And then, just as suddenly, the moment was gone. The horse stepped back, turning its head toward the horizon. The father watched as it walked away, its gait steady and purposeful, until it vanished into the distance. A feeling of finality washed over him. Whatever had been, whatever had happened on this land, had run its course. The past was behind them now, and the future, though uncertain, was theirs to shape. The family slowly began to rebuild. They repaired the house, tended to the farm, and continued their lives as best as they could. The land, though changed, seemed to offer them a kind of quiet resilience, as if it, too, had been through something extraordinary and had come out the other side stronger. The father found a new understanding of the world around him, a sense of respect for the forces that shaped it, and a deep appreciation for the unseen. It wasn't just the horse that had changed, it was them, too. They had seen the edge of something vast and unknowable, and though they might never fully understand it, they were no longer afraid. They had been given a glimpse into the world's mysteries, and that knowledge, though unsettling, gave them a sense of purpose. As the seasons passed, the farm began to feel like home again. The laughter of the children filled the house, the smell of fresh bread and the sound of hooves in the field. The past was a shadow, but it was a shadow that no longer held them captive. They had faced the unknown and come out the other side. And though the memory of that night lingered in their minds, it no longer controlled them. Years later, the farm was thriving once again. The children had grown into young adults, and the father, now older but still strong, stood on the porch looking out across the land. The horse was still there, still roaming the fields, though it no longer carried the same intensity it once had. It was simply a part of the farm now, like the trees, the soil, the wind, an unspoken guardian of a place that had weathered storms, both natural and supernatural. The father smiled softly, a sense of peace finally settling in his chest. He had come to understand that some things in life couldn't be explained, no matter how hard you tried. Some mysteries were meant to remain unsolved, and some forces were simply beyond human comprehension. But in the end, they had survived. They had learned to live with the unknown, to embrace it, and to respect the land that had borne them through it all. As the sun set over the fields, the father's gaze lingered on the horizon. The farm was his home. It always had been, even through the darkness, even through the fear. And no matter what the future held, he knew one thing for certain: it was theirs to face together.